My name is Theo. I am the head of the institutional products group at Elsevier. So I'm responsible for Pure and the other products we have in our portfolio, like Digital Commons, Cyber, and Institutional. And I'm really pleased to have the chance to talk to you a bit today. It's getting towards the end of the conference, and I personally have found it a really inspiring experience to listen to all the different ways in which Pure and our other products are being used, and to hear more about the challenges that people are facing and how they're addressing them. And I think what I wanted to talk to you about today was to take a few minutes to share a little bit of a broader perspective. So I'm not going to go into lots of product specifics and not to talk about lots of details. You've heard a lot of that over the last couple of days. But I'd like to take a chance to spend a few minutes with you and talk about some higher level themes. And I hope that this slightly broader perspective will complement the rich details that have been shared in other sessions. Oh, let's see that. I think we find ourselves now in an unusual and in some ways unprecedented times. A lot of effort at the moment for all of us is really focused on dealing with immediate issues, just keeping colleagues and students safe, of trying to rapidly adjust to new ways of working, and dealing with very large financial impacts. I mean, this is something that all of you are dealing with. Pat, in his opening talk, shared some examples of the way in which we've been trying to help. For example, we're setting up things like the Pure COVID portal. We've seen other areas, people quickly repurposing their digital commons repositories to support online education or online conferences. And at an Elsevier level, we've tried to do things like making content freely available. And I think that these are all short-term things that we will do and will continue doing. We're still in the middle of this, and the course of the next few months remains uncertain. But there are some broader observations that we could make, and I thought, especially as we come towards the end of this conference, it's worthwhile reflecting on that bigger picture. And I think when I think about the effects of the pandemic, I think about them in two ways. I think about them as accelerating existing trends. So we've been forced to very quickly adapt sometimes things that have been there, have been happening. And the most clear example, of course, is the very way that I'm speaking to you today, not in a conference room in Miami, but online. We've all learned to live with Zoom. But this acceleration of existing trends, I think, is a broader framing that helps us understand a little bit of what's happening in the world at the moment. But in addition to that, there is, of course, as there always is in these times of change, potential for radical shifts. And part of the challenge that all of us face is, how do we deal with that? How do we plan for that? How do we anticipate how the world might change post the immediate challenges of the pandemic? And, oops, slide's not quite responding. There we go. If I reflect on that perspective, on, well, what are the things that I see talking to customers and looking at the markets, and when we're fortunate at Elsevier to be able to work with so many different people from so many different parts of the world. So that does give us a bit of a broader perspective. If I think about the kinds of trends that we have existed in research for some years and are being accelerated in the current time, I point to the following four. First is this issue around access. This idea of open access, open science, and you've heard a lot about that in this conference, and Davina was just speaking about that in the previous session. But this idea of removing access barriers has been an important topic and has only been amplified, I think, by the current circumstances. When you think about access here, think about it more broadly than just open access. It's not just about access to published content. It's also about, for example, how do you share access to early stage research? So the growth of preprint servers and the growth of preprints to enable more rapid communication and more rapid collaboration across the world, that's a big feature, I think, of what we're seeing happening in the research community at the moment. And the need to respond quickly to things like developing COVID viruses or thinking about new treatments has only amplified the need to build better systems for this rapid communication. How you find people, how you find collaborators, that's certainly something I point to as an area that people have had to make rapid improvements in that amplifies an existing trend. The second one I'd highlight is this area of trust. Now, the discussions about research integrity, reproducibility have been ongoing for a long time, but I think the current environment, for reasons beyond just research, of course, have really amplified this question about how do we know what we can trust with what we see online? How do you know that you're getting trustworthy content? How do you know you're speaking to somebody who is the right expert at the right time? How do you know that what you're doing is something that you can rely on? I think the world as a whole is going through changes where we're building new systems and new approaches to how we deal with that. Previous ways this has worked, the previous gatekeepers, previous people we relied on in some ways, all of that is up for question. And how we deal with trust is at the heart of how research works and how society works. But I think it's a challenge for all of us, and it's something that we're thinking about a lot. How do we help universities, researchers demonstrate the quality of the work and stand out in the midst of all the noise that they have to try and distinguish themselves from? The third long-standing trend, and this is one you'll all recognize, is an ongoing challenge about the value of research. So this idea that people have to demonstrate the return on investment of research spending. How do we justify the, for example, societal impact of research? So you've seen that come back in multiple discussions around, for example, looking at the SDGs, which have come up in a number of sessions. These are really people looking for mechanisms for how do we show that research is having an impact. And you can think of that as how do researchers show impact, or from a funding point of view, how do funders invest in research that will have an impact? And the last point I'll make is that there is also this issue of a global rebalancing. So over the last 10 years, we've seen radical shifts in terms of where research is coming from. Tremendous growth in China and APAC and other emerging countries. The world is much more diverse, much more complex, much more global than it was. The kind of information that you need to understand your place in the world is now much broader. And I think that it underlies many of the trends that we see. But there are a couple of new questions as well. And I won't dwell on these too much because you will recognize them. And indeed, the answer to these questions is, by definition, really uncertain. But there's a couple of things that all people we're talking to are facing challenges with. There's issues about funding. So serious financial challenges in the short term, issues about where funding will come from. Again, not a new challenge, but really amplified by the current situation. There's a huge question mark about international students. Many universities or even university systems have built really strong models around supporting international students and international students supporting their funding flows. That's changed. It's changed very quickly and far more quickly than anyone might expect. What that will look like over the next couple of years remains very uncertain, and how universities adapt to that is a big question mark. There's a question about national research strategies, where people investing in the right thing, where they're making the right choices about the kinds of research areas they wanted to support in. Again, all of that is now up for question. Right? Are we going to change where research funding goes? Are we going to think about different things? I would guarantee that pandemic preparedness is going to get more funding than other things, but what else is going to change in the future? And there's new questions about things like security. How do you ensure the security of your research, your intellectual property? There are concerns, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, about how different nations work together. We're seeing that come through in terms of what people are thinking about and what they're demanding from their systems. So lots of change. I threw up this slide, and I won't dwell on it just for time, but it's just a little reminder that the change is, of course, the natural environment we work in. This is a view of the THE University rankings, and I just quickly pulled out, well, how much did the rankings change in, let's say, roughly speaking, the last 10 years? So if you compare the universities that were in the top 100 in 2012 with the universities that are in the top 100 in the most recent rankings, what you see is that 35 are more or less in the same place, plus or minus 5 places. 18 universities improved a lot. 23 universities went down a lot, more than 5, and 24 new entrants came into the rankings, which means, by implication, of course, 24 universities left. That's a lot of change. It's a lot of change in 10 years. And there's a breakdown on those graphs about where the universities left from, if you like, which regions were they, and where did they come from. And the only observation I'd like to make is where they came from is very diverse. It's not just a simple story of a particular region growing. Across the world, even within, for example, take France, you have a number of French universities leaving, a number of French universities entering as well. So there's a lot of churn, both locally, as universities try to stand out, but also globally, as many new parts of the world are entering, are raising themselves up to become major research producers and major research nations. So these are the broad challenges. And if I think about what do I see universities doing to respond to that, I would highlight 3 things. So the first is this emphasis on data-driven decision-making. Now, this is an interesting thing because, of course, it's a common cliche. We should make data-driven decisions. But it's worthwhile reflecting on that a little bit. Right? First of all, data doesn't make decisions. People do, and you can make decisions without data. So I think the real reason why this is something that's more important is precisely this reason about the world becoming more interconnected and more complex. Because of that, it's harder to rely on traditional forms of decisions, harder to rely on close networks, harder to rely on what you might know from your perspective. So because of that, people are increasingly looking for broader sets of information to make the right decisions. And not all information is useful, right? So some of it is noise. So what kind of information do we see as being the kinds of things we want to bring forward as useful? Well, I'd identify 3 types. The first is information that gives you a global view. It basically fills in spaces that helps you know what you don't know. Right? How do you understand what's happening in different parts of the world that are quite far away from you? So that global view, I think, is really important. Second one is this idea of benchmarking, the idea of being able to give you ways to understand how to set your level of ambition. Right? How do you know what you should be aiming at? And sometimes you can, if you only look too closely, you miss the opportunities for more radical changes. And the third thing we're focused on is how do we provide insights? So how do we expand your view on what's possible or give you new ways to understand the root causes of what's happening, what you're seeing around you? So those are the kinds of data that we want to provide to you. The other thing we see, and it follows on very nicely from what Henrik and Davina were talking about in terms of the community module, is the idea of much more working together in what I might call regional clusters. It's going to be regions, could be cities, could be regions in countries, could be national level. But this idea of how do you work together to essentially get better scale, stand out, is a really important piece of this. I think there's also a strong social equity and economic development aspect to this as well. It's how do top institutions, perhaps in a region, help other surrounding institutions raise their level? How do they show more impact in the local community? And that's definitely a theme that comes through quite a lot. And the last one I'd highlight is improved infrastructure in terms of how we support researchers. There's so many more compliance burdens, so many questions, all those things I talked about in terms of how we want improved research integrity and improved research reproducibility. That leads to the need for better systems to support researchers who, frankly, in many cases, are drowning under the burden of all the things they have to do. So a lot of what we see is people making investments to try and reduce the burden of that. Someone in a talk introduced the idea of the word deburden. I think that's a common theme that we see across the world. I think, just to close, I'll mention a couple of things that we have as our ambitions. So how do we look at this problem, and what are the kind of guiding principles we have? And I think that there's 3 I want to highlight. The first is that we're focused on trying to provide best-in-class solutions. So in our product portfolio, we want to make sure that these products serve you as well as possible, that they're the best possible user experiences. But we mean this not just in the product sense, also thinking about things like, for example, the total cost of ownership. How do we reduce the amount of work that you have to do? How do we reduce the cost for your institution in terms of time and effort and investment? And how do we make it easier to adopt these? These are sort of guiding principles that we're trying to implement across the portfolio. There's a huge push we're making in terms of giving you broader data sets. So we want to bring in many more types of data into our ecosystem. So it's not just about Scopus and publications. It's also about bringing in new kinds of data like good view of awarded grants, policy and clinical citations, more attention metrics like media mentions. How do we give you a broader view of the world around you and try and develop high quality data sets with high quality metrics that allow you to make those better decisions we talked about? And the last point, and I'll end here and leave some time for any questions, is thinking about how do we tie these products together in ways that help you scale with your ambitions, whether you're trying to affect change at your institutional level or do it at a regional level with group institutions or thinking about a national strategy. We want to be able to adapt to the level you want to work with. And that's why we're making investments in things like importing third-party data sources into Pure or trying to think about things like the community module. They're really about trying to enable you to be more effective at working it across these multiple levels that you need to work at these days as a research institution. I hope that gives you some flavor of how we're thinking about it and some of the things we're seeing. I think you hopefully see many of the themes in the conference reflected here, because these are the sort of beliefs we have in terms of how we're thinking about where we want to take our portfolio. It's a journey. There's many things we want to do. There's a lot we want to do in terms of fixing practical problems and making these products work together. But there's an overall ambition we have in terms of thinking about how do we help research and research institutions be more effective, deal with changes and deal with challenges like COVID, but also the long-term challenges about how does research become more effective and play a bigger contribution in the world. I'll stop there if there are any questions.
Thank you, Theo. It certainly is a uncertain time, and we're dealing with some uncharted territories, but really helpful to see some insights and takeaways you're seeing at the institutional level. One question, has Elsevier shifted or changed any of its business processes, either short-term or long-term, due to the COVID impact, or what you're hearing from institutions?
Could you perhaps clarify, Kim, what do you mean by business processes? Or is that a question?
So such as strategies or way you work with or approach clients or the research data.
Yes. Yeah.
It's pretty open-ended in terms of processes, as there are so many at Elsevier and many at Pure as well.
So that's true. So I think there's a couple of things I'd highlight. One is that it's really forced us to think differently about how do we communicate with people. So how do we work with clients? We had relied, of course, a lot on face-to-face communication and talking to people and visiting people. And a lot, as everybody else, we had to think about how does this work in an online environment. And one of the biggest challenges actually is making sure that we stay close enough to what the real problems are, so that we are thinking about how do we make sure that we continue to get your feedback, high quality feedback from people in terms of where they'd like products to go, what their needs are, what their challenges are. And for us, it was actually at the start a big challenge to think about how do we do this effectively. So we didn't want to create more demands on people's time as they dealt with the initial challenges in COVID, but we wanted to find ways in which we could, certainly as things became, if you like, as we adapt to different ways of working, finding ways to talk to people, reach out and understand how could we help. I think that was one of the business processes that changed. The second one is it's forced us to reconsider our roadmaps a little bit, to think about, are there ways in which we can accelerate some of our plans, for example, around helping the products work closer together so people get more value out of their investments, help people adapt perhaps our roadmaps to focus on features that help you deal with some of these short-term challenges. So there's some good examples, for example, in digital commons, where we actively sort of think about, is there more we can do around online education or around online conferences that allow people to quickly reuse an investment they've already made? So rather than having to go out and buy something new or think about something else you have to do, if you've already made an investment in digital commons, can we adapt that investment for you quickly to help you respond? So I'd highlight those kinds of changes that we've seen.
It's great highlighting the adaptive nature of Elsevier and Pure. That's certainly helpful. And also having the in-person option taken away, it's great that we do have technology available at this time, because otherwise we wouldn't be having this conference or being able to interact with all of our cohort and collaborative researchers and so many other people in our network. So great. Thank you, Theo.